The first lie of retirement is that you'll have nothing to do. My own retirement, now in its third year, had been the most gloriously occupied period of my entire life. After 35 years of lecturing on the political follies of the late Roman Republic, my time was finally my own, a vast uncharted territory to be explored at my own pace. My husband, Robert, a retired architect, and I had curated a life in Asheville, North Carolina, that was as quiet, orderly, and beautiful as the Blue Ridge Mountains that cradled our small home. Our days were a gentle, predictable rhythm of shared passions, his watercolors, my garden, our books. So many books that our house was less a dwelling and more a library with a kitchen attached. Every wall was lined with shelves Robert had built, each one groaning under the weight of history, art, and literature. My current passion project was a ridiculously ambitious, self-appointed task, a meticulously cross-referenced history of the Silk Road told not through the lens of emperors and merchants, but through the humble day-to-day objects that had made the journey. I was tracing the history of paper, of silk, of the lapis lazuli that had been painstakingly mined in the mountains of Afghanistan to be ground into the brilliant ultramarine blue of a Renaissance painting. It was a puzzle of immense complexity, a story of human connection that spanned continents and centuries. It was the kind of deep, focused, and utterly peaceful work that I had craved my entire academic career. This morning, I was in heaven. I was sitting in my sunroom, a mug of Earl Grey steaming beside me, surrounded by a dozen open books, cross-referencing a Han Dynasty trade manifest with a Roman historian's account of Parthian tariffs. The air smelled of old paper and the damp, rich earth of the garden just outside the window. Robert was at his desk on the other side of the room, a splash of brilliant cerulean blue on his palette as he worked on a landscape painting of the mountains. It's a soft scratch of his brush. On the paper, a familiar, comforting counterpoint to the chirping of the morning birds. This was it. The peace. The life we had worked for. The sanctuary we had built together after a lifetime of professional obligations and, for me, a lifetime of familial chaos I had long since walled off. Listen to this. I said, my voice full of the particular excitement only a historian can feel for a truly obscure fact. Pliny the Elder complained that the Roman Empire was spending 100 million sesterces a year on goods from the East. He said it was the price of luxury and our women. He was blaming the trade deficit on silk dresses. Robert chuckled. Without looking up from his painting. Some things never change, my love. It's always the women's fault, isn't it? Always, I agreed with a smile, making a note in the margins of my notebook. The quiet, comfortable intimacy of our shared work was the bedrock of my happiness. Here in this sun-drenched room, the world was a logical, beautiful, and endlessly fascinating place. The messy, unpredictable, and often cruel world of human relationships felt a million miles away. It was in this state of perfect academic bliss that the phone rang. The sound was a jarring intrusion, an alien noise in our quiet sanctuary. Wasn't either of our cell phones? It was the landline, a piece of technology we kept mostly for nostalgic reasons and for emergencies. It rarely rang. When it did, the sound always carried a faint electric hum of dread. Robert put down his brush. "I'll get it," he said. I watched him walk to the kitchen and pick up the receiver. "Hello," he said, his voice its usual, warm baritone. I saw his expression shift. He frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Yes, she's here. One moment." He covered the receiver with his hand and looked at me, his eyes dark with a sudden, inexplicable worry. "Ellie," he said, his voice low. "It's a collect call. From an automated operator from the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta. I stared at him, my mind a complete blank. A federal prison. It had to be a mistake. A wrong number. We didn't know anyone in prison. Took the phone from his hand, my own hand suddenly unsteady. Oh! A flat, robotic voice spoke. You have a collect call from an inmate at a federal correctional facility. To accept the charges, press 1. My mind raced. Former student, perhaps? Someone who had fallen on hard times. Driven by a morbid academic curiosity, I pressed. The number 1. There was a loud click, and then a voice from a past I had tried so hard to bury filled my ear. A voice that was both intimately familiar and horribly alien. Ellie, is that you? Thank God. It was my brother, Danny. The sound of his voice was a physical shock. A jolt that seemed to travel up my arm and seize the muscles in my chest. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 2 years, not since the last time I had refused to co-sign a loan. For one of his harebrained get-rich-quick schemes. Danny. I breathed, my voice barely a whisper. What is this? Where are you? I'm in Atlanta, Ellie, he said, his voice a frantic, desperate rush. Listen, I don't have much time. My last appeal. It was denied. Oh, the sentence is final. 15 years. 15 years. The number was an abstraction, a lifetime. For what? I asked, my voice numb. The last I heard, you were being investigated for some kind of investment thing. Fraud, he said, the word a bitter, self-pitying puff of air. A pyramid scheme, they called it. It wasn't. It was just a business deal that went bad. It doesn't matter. The point is, I'm here, and I'm not getting out. I sank into a kitchen chair, Robert's hand coming to rest on my shoulder, a warm, grounding presence in the middle of my suddenly disintegrating world. And Lori, I asked, referring to the latest in his long line of disastrous relationships. The mother of his children. Where is she? What is she going to do? He let out a short, harsh laugh that was more of a sob. Lori's gone, Ellie. She packed a bag and disappeared the day I was convicted. Her number is disconnected. My lawyers I can't find a trace of her. She's gone. She left them. Them? The word hung in the air, a cold, heavy weight. Not just a pronoun, a responsibility, a catastrophe. The kids! I asked, my voice now trembling. Danny, where are the kids? That's why I'm calling, he said, his voice now taking on a tone of desperate, urgent command. They're in emergency custody. With CPS, but it's temporary. They're about to become wards of the state, Ellie. They're going to. Be split up, sent into the system. He took a ragged breath. Jenna is 16. The twins, Mark and Matt, are 14. Sophie is 10, and little Leo. He just turned 5. He listed their names, a roll call of the casualties of his own reckless life. 5 children, 5 lives about to be shattered. I felt a wave of nausea, a profound, sickening pity for these children who were, by the thinnest of genetic threads, my family. That's horrible, Danny, I whispered. That's just horrible. I know, he said. And then the reason for the call, the real purpose of this devastating information dump, was delivered. It was not a question. It was not a plea. It was a directive, a foregone conclusion, delivered from a man who had hit absolute rock bottom but had somehow managed to retain his lifelong, unshakable sense of entitlement. Asterisk, you have to take them, Ellie, he said, his voice now firm, as if he were assigning a task to a subordinate. You're their only family. It's your duty. I stood there in my quiet, peaceful kitchen, the receiver cold against my ear, and felt the carefully constructed world of my retirement shatter into a million pieces. He was asking me to take in 5 children, a 16-year-old girl I barely knew, 2 teenage boys, a 10-year-old and a 5-year-old. He was asking me, a 64-year-old woman who had deliberately, thoughtfully, joyfully built a child-free life, to become an instant mother to a large, traumatized family. He was asking me to trade my library for a life of parent-teacher, conferences, of soccer practice, of teenage angst and toddler tantrums. He was asking me to sacrifice the peace I had spent a lifetime earning on the altar of his own. It's catastrophic failure. As I stood there, mute with shock, my mind, a historian's mind, flashed back. The demand, so shocking in its scale, was not new in its nature. It was merely the final, ugliest iteration of a pattern that had defined our entire lives. I am 28 years old. I am a graduate student, living on a meager stipend. My life a frantic, sleep-deprived scramble of teaching, research, and writing my dissertation. It is 2 in the morning when the phone rings. It's my mother, her voice a hysterical whisper. Danny, my 22-year-old brother, the charming, reckless golden boy, has been arrested. He and his friends, after a night of heavy drinking, made a stupid bet. He tried to drive his beat-up Mustang across a golf course, and he crashed it into a water hazard on the 18th hole. He's facing a DUI, destruction of property, a whole host of charges that could see him expelled from college and saddle him with a criminal record. My parents are a mess. They don't have the money for a good lawyer. My father is threatening to let him rot in jail to teach him a lesson. My mother is terrified. They are paralyzed. And so, as always, they call me, the responsible one. I don't sleep for the next 3 days. I drain my savings account, the money I had been carefully hoarding for a research trip to Rome, and I hire the best lawyer I can find. I spend hours on the phone with the dean of his university, pleading his case, emphasizing his potential. I broker a deal with the golf course, agreeing to a monthly payment plan out of my own pathetic salary to pay for the damages. I fix it. I clean up his mess. When it's all over, when the charges have been reduced and his permanent record is safe, I sit with him in a cheap diner. He is not grateful. He is not remorseful. He is just charming. I owe you big time, Ellie, he says, with that easy, dazzling smile that has always been his greatest asset and his most dangerous weapon. I'll pay you back every penny, I swear. He never does. Of course, he never mentions it again. The money, the sleepless nights, the stress that nearly derailed my own academic career, it all just gets absorbed into the silent, unwritten ledger of my role in the family. I am the fixer, the savior, and my reward is simply the continuation of his chaos. Ellie, are you there? Danny's voice, tinny and distant, pulled me back to the present. I was back in my kitchen, a 64-year-old woman, the phone still pressed to my ear. Robert was watching me, his face a mask of deep, helpless concern. My brother from a prison cell 1,000 miles away was asking me to fix his life one last time. But this time, the price was not a few $1,000s I couldn't afford. This time, the price was everything else. I have to go. Danny, I said, my voice a hollow, unfamiliar sound. Wait, Ellie, tell me you'll do it. Just tell me. You'll take them. I need to know they're safe. He didn't need to know they were safe. He needed to know he was absolved. He needed to be able to hand over his parental responsibility so he could serve his time in peace. I did not answer him. I just slowly, deliberately placed the receiver back in its cradle, cutting off the connection, cutting off his voice. Silence that rushed back in was profound. It was the sound of my beautiful, quiet, and orderly life, and it had just been given a death sentence. And I was the only one who could grant the stay of execution. The moment I hung up the phone, the quiet of our sunroom ceased to be peaceful, became a ringing, deafening silence, the sound of a bomb having just detonated, the shock wave still expanding, unseen. Through the foundations of our life, I stood, motionless, the receiver still cold in my hand, my mind a white-hot blank. The carefully curated world of my retirement, with its gentle rhythms of research and gardening, had been vaporized. In its place was a gaping, smoking crater, and at the bottom of it, 5 children I barely knew. Robert was by my side in an instant, his hand warm on my arm. He guided me to a chair, his touch the only solid, real thing in a world that had suddenly become unstable and terrifying. "Ellie," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor. "What did he say? What did he want?" "He wants us to take the children," I said, the words feeling alien and absurd on my tongue. "All 5 of them, for 15 years. Robert stared at me, his architect's mind, a mind built on logic, and the practical limits of space and material struggling to compute the sheer scale of the demand. 5, he repeated, his voice a breath of pure disbelief. "But that's impossible. Our life, our home. How could we possibly?" His voice trailed off, the logistical impossibilities piling up so high and so fast they were insurmountable. This wasn't a request to host a grandchild for a summer holiday. This was a demand for a complete and total demolition of our lives. It was a command to abandon the people we had become. The 64 and 67-year-old retirees who had earned their peace, and to become, overnight, the bewildered, exhausted parents of a large, traumatized, and instantly formed family. The initial shock, the sheer, paralyzing absurdity of the demand, lasted for the rest of the day. We moved through our home like ghosts, our usual comforting routines now feeling like relics from a bygone era. We didn't talk about it. We couldn't. The problem was too large, too monstrous to be approached head-on. That night, we lay in bed, side by side in the dark, the silence between us filled with the frantic, unspoken calculations of what our lives were about to become. The next morning, the historian in me finally woke up, pushing past the panicked emotional paralysis. A historian, when faced with an overwhelming crisis, does not simply react. They research. They gather the facts. They contextualize. We need to understand exactly what this means. I said to Robert over a breakfast we were both just pushing around our plates. Not as a vague, terrifying idea, but as a concrete, logistical, and financial reality. For the next 3 days, our quiet, scholarly sanctuary transformed into a crisis management center. We didn't just worry, we worked. Robert, the architect, took out the original blueprints of our 2-bedroom, 1,500-square-foot house. He tried to figure out the logistics. Bunk beds in the guest room, a pull-out sofa in my study. He spent hours sketching, trying to solve an unsolvable geometric problem. How do you fit 7 human beings into a space designed for the quiet comfort of 2? His face grew grimmer with every failed attempt. Our house wasn't just a building. It was a physical manifestation of our child-free life. It was a home with no room for children. My own task was a deep, painful dive into the financial and emotional realities. Who had spent the last year tracing the flow of ancient Roman currency, now found myself building a spreadsheet of a different kind. I researched the average annual cost of raising a child in North Carolina. I multiplied it by 5. I factored in healthcare, clothing, food, car insurance for a 16. I projected the costs of college tuition, The numbers were staggering, apocalyptic. Our comfortable, carefully planned retirement savings, the nest egg we had spent 40 years building, would be completely wiped out in less than 5 years. We would be forced to sell our home. We would be plunged back into a world of financial precarity we had fought our entire lives to escape. Danny wasn't just asking for our time and our energy. He was asking for our solvency. He was asking for our future. I made a difficult off-the-record phone call to a former student of mine who is now a senior social worker in Raleigh. I explained the situation hypothetically. She was compassionate, but her assessment was brutal and unflinching. Dr. Vance, she said, her voice full of a weary professionalism, you need to understand what you would be taking on. These aren't just 5 kids who need a place to live. These are children who have been living in a deeply unstable environment, whose mother has abandoned them, and whose father is a convicted felon. The older ones, the teenagers, they will likely have significant behavioral and emotional issues, attachment disorders, anger, trust issues. You and your husband would not just be parents. You would be full-time trauma counselors. You, at 64 and 67, truly equipped for that. It is a job that breaks 30-year-olds. Her words confirmed my deepest fears. The demand was not just for our home and our money. It was for our mental and physical health. It was a demand for a kind of resilience, a kind of primal parental energy that we simply no longer possessed. And as I gathered this mountain of cold, hard, logistical data, the ghosts of the past began to emerge. Not as vague feelings, but as sharp, specific, and damning pieces of evidence. Every spreadsheet cell, every grim statistic seemed to trigger another memory of my brother's lifelong pattern of reckless charm and the wreckage he left in his wake. I was at my desk, looking at a projection for the cost of feeding 2 teenage boys, when a memory so vivid it felt like it was happening right now ambushed me. I am 32, a freshly minted assistant professor, drowning in debt and working 80 hours a week to prepare my first lectures. Danny, now 26, is a charming, fast-talking college dropout who has just received a small inheritance from our grandmother. $10,000, a fortune to me, a pittance to him. He takes me to a fancy dinner, something I can't afford. He is electric with a new idea, a can't-miss business venture, importing artisanal, unfiltered olive oil from a secret village in Tuscany. It's the next big thing, Ellie, he says, his eyes gleaming with that familiar, dangerous fire of unearned confidence. We get in on the ground floor. We'll be rich. He needs more capital, he explains. Another $10,000 to match our grandmother's gift. He promises me a full partnership. He paints a beautiful picture of our future, of us, the Vance siblings, building an empire together. He is so charming, so utterly convinced of his own brilliance, that my own cautious, Demic nature feels like a boring, cowardly flaw. I want to believe him. Part of me, the little sister who has always craved her golden boy brother's approval, is desperate to believe him, so I do it. I take out a personal loan. I give him the money. 6 months later, the olive oil empire is bankrupt. The shipment from Italy, it turned out, was just a crate of cheap, rancid cooking oil he had bought from a fraudulent supplier. The money is gone, all of it. When I confront him, he is not apologetic. He is the victim. How was I supposed to know the guy was a crook? He says with a shrug, it was a good idea. I just got unlucky. He seems genuinely surprised when I ask him about my $10,000. Ellie, it was an investment. Investments are a risk. That's how it works. He says it with no malice. It's a simple statement of fact from his point of view. My money, my debt, my problem. He never mentions it again. The memory faded, leaving a bitter, familiar taste in my mouth. I looked at the spreadsheet on my screen. This situation, the one I was in right now, was not a new crisis. It was the same story, just with a higher, more catastrophic price. Danny had once again made a series of terrible, reckless decisions. And I, the responsible older sister, was once again being expected to absorb the debt. But this time, the debt was not $10,000. It was 5 human lives. That night, Robert and I sat on our porch, the cool mountain air a welcome relief. We had all the data, the financial projections, the logistical impossibilities, the psychological assessments, the weight of the past. The case file was complete. "We can't do it, Ellie," Robert said softly, his voice full of a deep, sorrowful certainty. He reached for my hand. "It's not just about the money or the house. We are not the people these children need. They need young, energetic parents. They need therapists. They need a miracle. Oh. And we are just 2 tired old people who love our quiet life. But the foster system," I whispered, the guilt a physical weight on my chest. "They'll be separated." "And that is a tragedy," he said, his grip tightening on my hand. "A tragedy that he created. This is not your fault, Eleanor. You have spent your entire life cleaning up his messes. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep the memory of his children warm. Your duty is to the life we have built together. It's the peace you have earned." He was right. His words, so full of love and a fierce, protective logic, were the final piece of evidence I needed. My responsibility was not to enable my brother's final, most catastrophic act of irresponsibility. My responsibility was to the truth. And the truth was, I was not the solution. The next day, I accepted the collect call from the prison. My heart was pounding, but my voice, when I spoke, was calm and steady. "Danny," I said, before he could even speak, "I have an answer for you." "God, Ellie," he said, a wave of relieved entitlement in his voice. "I knew you'd do the right thing. So, when can you?" "No, Danny," I cut him off. The word was quiet, but it was absolute. It was the sound of a door that had been open for 50 years, finally, irrevocably closing. "What?" he stammered, his confident tone vanishing. "What did you say?" They repeated, my voice clear and firm. "I will not be taking the children. Robert and I cannot do it. We are not able to provide the home and the care that they need and deserve." "But you're all they have," he sputtered, his voice rising with disbelief and rage. "You can't just abandon them. They are your family. It is your duty." "No, Danny," I said, and the words were the coldest, most honest I had ever spoken to him. "They are your children. They were your duty. And I will not spend the rest of my life paying the price for the fact that you have failed them." I did not wait for his reply. I did not wait for the rage, for the accusations, for the guilt. I just quietly, gently placed the receiver back into its cradle. The connection was cut, the conversation was over, and the refusal was final. My refusal was a declaration of war. I had known there would be consequences, but I was not prepared for the speed or the ferocity of the counterattack. The first salvo came, as expected, from Danny. The collect call from the prison arrived the next morning. This time, I knew what was coming. I took the call in my study, Robert standing quietly by the window, a silent, supportive presence. "You selfish bitch," Danny hissed the moment the call connected. There was no preamble, no charm. The desperate man was gone, replaced by the cornered, rabid animal I remembered from my youth. You would let my children, your own blood, your own family, rot in the system just to protect your precious, quiet little life. After everything I've done for you, the sheer breathtaking audacity of that final question almost made me laugh. Everything he had done for me, he had it completely inverted. It built an entire reality in his mind where he was the benevolent older brother and I was the ungrateful beneficiary. I was always there for you, Ellie, he raged, his voice cracking with self-pity. Who helped you with your homework? Who taught you how to drive? And this is how you repay me. By throwing my kids in the garbage? They're going to be separated. Do you understand that? You're going to be abused and forgotten, and it will be your fault. Their entire ruined lives will be on your head. How are you going to sleep at night? Knowing you did this to them? Knowing you murdered their future? He went on for 10 solid minutes, a torrential, rambling monologue of accusations, guilt trips, and twisted memories. He painted a picture of himself as the tragic hero and me as the cold, vengeful monster. I listened to it all. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I just let the storm of his words wash over me. My silence was a wall he could not breach. And it infuriated him. Are you even listening to me? He finally screamed, his voice hoarse. I'm listening, Danny, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I'm listening to the same story you've been telling yourself your entire life. The one where nothing is ever your fault. Damn you, Ellie, he whispered, his rage spent, replaced by a venomous, defeated hiss. Damn you to hell. He slammed the phone down, the connection cutting out with a brutal final click. I placed the receiver back in its cradle, my hand perfectly steady. Robert came over and put his arms around me. Are you all right? Yes, I said, leaning into his embrace. His anger. It doesn't hurt anymore. It's just pathetic. What? Well, his anger didn't hurt. The seeds of guilt he had planted had found fertile soil. And they were about to be watered by a far more powerful, more rational, and more terrifying source. The call from Child Protective Services came 2 days later. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Maria Garcia, the case manager for the Vance children. Her voice was exactly what I had feared. It was kind, professional, and completely reasonable. It was the voice of the system. It was far more devastating than my brother's impotent rage. Dr. Vance, she began, her tone respectful. I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me. And I want to be very clear from the outset. I understand the monumental nature of what your brother has asked of you. You are under no legal obligation whatsoever to take in his children. My purpose in calling is simply to ensure you are making your decision with a full and clear understanding of the situation. For the next hour, Ms. Garcia, with a calm, heartbreaking precision, painted a mural of the grim reality of the foster care system. It was not a lecture. It was a dispassionate presentation of facts, and that is what made it so horrific. A sibling group of this size is what we call a hard placement, she explained, her voice devoid of emotion. Finding a single foster home, that is, willing and able to take in 5 children, especially with 2 teenagers in the mix, is a statistical impossibility. I have been doing this for 15 years, and I have never seen it happen. So what will happen to them? I asked. My own voice a dry croak. They will be separated, she stated, as a simple fact. That is the near certain outcome. We would prioritize keeping the 2 youngest, Sophie and Leo, together. But the 2 14-year-old boys would almost certainly be sent to a separate placement. And Jenna, at 16, she would be sent to a group home for older teens. To prognosis for children in those facilities, I am sorry to say, is not good. She would age out of the system in 2 years, with no family support and very few resources. My study, my beautiful sunlit room filled with the quiet, orderly stories of the past, suddenly felt like a cold, airless tomb. I could feel the invisible threads of responsibility, of guilt, wrapping themselves around me. I've met with the children, Ms. Garcia continued, her professional tone softening for the first time with a hint of human compassion. They are good kids, Dr. Vance. They are scared and they are traumatized, but they are resilient. Jenna, the oldest, she's a talented artist. She draws in a little notebook she carries everywhere. The twins, they're inseparable. Finish each other's sentences. And the little ones, Sophie and Leo, they just cling to each other. Their primary attachment now is to each other. Separating them will cause a profound and likely permanent psychological wound. She paused, letting the full weight of her words settle over me. Again, she said, her voice returning to its professional cadence. You are not legally obligated, but I am. My legal and ethical obligation is to the best interests of these children. And from every conceivable angle, stability, emotional, well-being, long-term outcomes, their best interest is to be with family, to be with you. She sighed, a sound of deep institutional weariness. You are their only hope, Dr. Vance. I am just asking you to please. Before you make a final decision, understand what that hope represents. The call ended. I sat in my chair, the silence of the room now a roaring accusation. This was no longer about Danny. This was about Jenna, the 16-year-old artist. It was about Mark and Matt, the inseparable twins. It was about Sophie and Leo, the terrified little ones. These were not just names on a list. They were real children. My niece, my nephews. The cold, hard reality was that my decision, too. Say no. A decision that felt so right and so necessary for my own self-preservation was a potential death sentence for their future as a family. Robert and I barely spoke for days. We moved around each other, the unspoken question hanging in the air between us, a toxic radioactive cloud. Are we monsters? Are we doing the right thing? The peace of our home was gone, replaced by a constant, grinding guilt. The joy I had, once taken in my research, in my garden, felt like a selfish indulgence in the face of their suffering. The final blow came in the form of letters and emails. The news had spread through our extended family. The story twisted and retold until it had become a simple, damning narrative. The rich, successful, childless professor and her architect husband were too selfish to save their own flesh and blood. My cousins, my aunts, people I hadn't seen in a decade, felt compelled to weigh in, to cast their stone. Ellie, I can't believe you would abandon your own blood like this. Your mother would be ashamed. I am praying for you to find some compassion in your heart. You are choosing your books and your quiet over 5 innocent children. You are a disgrace to this family. I felt like I was drowning. My carefully constructed life, my hard-won peace, my very sense of my own moral character was all being eroded by this impossible choice. I began to second-guess everything. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was a monster. Maybe my duty was, as Danny had said, to simply take them, to sacrifice my own life on the altar of his failure. I was at my lowest point. A few weeks after the first call, when a thick, official-looking envelope arrived. It was from the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, forwarded from the case office in Atlanta. My heart sank. 'Twas likely more paperwork, more formal notification of the children's status, another bureaucratic twist of the knife. I opened it. my hands trembling. Inside was not a form letter. Was a small stack of papers held together with a paperclip. On top was a note from Ms. Garcia. "Dr. Vance, I thought you should see this. It's from Jenna." Underneath was a letter written in the neat, careful handwriting of a 16-year-old girl. Okay. And tucked inside the folded pages were 5 small, heartbreakingly amateurish pencil sketches. One of each of the children. I looked at the drawings first. A portrait of 2 identical boys grinning, their arms slung around each other. A small, dark-eyed girl with a serious expression. A tiny, smiling boy holding a teddy bear. And a self-portrait. A girl with large, sad eyes staring out from the page. Then I read the letter. "Dear Aunt Eleanor," it began. "Ms. Garcia said it was okay for me to write to you. I hope you don't mind. I know you said you can't take us, and I want you to know that I understand. I'm not angry. I know it's a lot to ask. I don't really remember you much. I remember Mom used to talk about you sometimes. She said you were the smart one, the one who got away. I'm worried about my brothers and my sister. They want to put us in different houses. I told them I won't let them. I'm 16. I'll get a job. I can take care of them. I just need to figure out how. There's one other thing. It's probably stupid. Mom used to talk about her own parents sometimes. Our other grandparents. She said they lived in Florida on the water and that her dad used to take her fishing. But she said they didn't want anything to do with us after she married our dad. I don't know if they're still alive or if that's even the real story. It's probably not. But it's just something I think about sometimes. Anyway, I hope you are well. Thank you for reading my letter. Sincerely, Jenna Vance." I read the letter. The fog of my guilt, the noise of my family's accusations, the weight of the world's judgment, it all just receded. This letter was not a plea for rescue. It was a quiet, stoic, and heartbreakingly mature statement of fact from a child who had been forced to become an adult too soon. And hidden within it was a single, tiny, almost hopeless clue. Her parents in Florida. A new thought, a new path, a new possibility began to form in my mind. I was not a mother. I was not a savior. I could not provide the home these children needed. But I was something else. I was a historian. I was a damn good researcher. Maybe I couldn't save them. But what if I could find someone who could? I stood up and walked to my desk, Jenna's letter in my hand. For the first time in weeks, the crushing weight of the moral dilemma was gone, replaced by the clear, sharp, and exhilarating focus of a research problem. The fallout had been devastating, but the path to a new kind of resolution was just beginning. The letter from my niece, Jenna, was not a plea. It was a catalyst. It was a single, hard data point of quiet courage that cut through the fog of my guilt and the noise of my family's condemnations. For weeks, Robert and I had been trapped in a binary problem of our own making. Either we sacrificed our lives, or we sacrificed the children. Jenna's letter, with its small, almost hopeless mention of her maternal grandparents, presented a third possibility. It was a whisper of an alternative, a path that was not about martyrdom or abandonment, but about investigation. It was a research problem. And research was a language I understood. He always said they were deadbeats. I said to Robert that. Evening, holding Jenna's letter, the 5 small pencil-drawn portraits spread across our coffee table. Danny's exact words, "For years," were that Lori's parents were Florida trash who wanted nothing to do with their own daughter, let alone her kids. We never had a reason to question it. "He's a con man, Ellie," Robert said gently, his eyes on the drawing of the 2 smiling twin boys. "His entire life is a curated narrative designed to serve his own needs." Why would his description of his in-laws be any different? He was right. I had spent a lifetime listening to my brother's stories, and it had never once occurred to me to fact-check them. "So what do we do?" he asked. A new sense of purpose, clean and sharp, began to cut through my despair. "We do what I should have done years ago," I said. "We stop listening to Danny's story and we find the real one." Our first step was a difficult but necessary one. The next morning, we sat down with our financial advisor. We explained the situation, the 5 children, the need for a significant liquid fund. We made the decision to liquidate a quarter of our retirement portfolio. It was a massive sum, a painful chunk of the security we had worked our entire lives to build. But as I signed the papers, it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like an investment. It was a strategic, controlled sacrifice, and it was on our terms. It was the funding for our new project. My next call was to a man my university's legal department sometimes used for sensitive work. He was a private investigator, a former journalist named Frank Miller, and his specialty was finding people who did not want to be found. I explained the situation, giving him the few scant details I had. The mother's name, Lori Sullivan. Her parents' names, unknown. And a single vague location, Florida on the water. "That's not a lot to go on, Dr. Vance," he said, his voice a gravelly, professional baritone. "Sullivan is a common name, and Florida has a lot of water, but I'll see what I can dig up." While Frank began his digital search, I began my own, a different kind. I was a historian. Frank was looking for a person in the present. I would look for the ghost of their past. I spent the next 2 weeks immersed in the digital archives of my university's library. A world of genealogical records, digitized newspapers, and public databases. I was no longer a grieving, guilty sister. I was a researcher on the trail of a cold case. Frank's initial searches hit the same walls I did. Lori Sullivan, born in 1975, had a sparse, messy public record that matched the chaos of her life with Danny. Her parents, however, were ghosts. There were dozens of potential Michael and Helen Sullivans in Florida, but none with any clear connection to Lori after the year 2005. It was as if they had simply vanished. People don't just vanish. I said to Robert one night, surrounded by a sea of printed-out records. They change their names, they move, they go off-grid, but they always leave a footprint. My breakthrough came at 2 in the morning, deep in the digital archives of the Sarasota Herald-Tribune. I had been painstakingly scrolling through years of microfilm, looking for anything, a traffic ticket, a property deed, and then I found it. A single, grainy photograph in the society pages from June of 2008. It was a wedding announcement. Vance Sullivan nuptials. The photo was of a young, impossibly happy-looking Danny and a radiant Lori. But it was the text that made my heart stop. The bride is the daughter of Captain Michael and Mrs. Helen Sullivan of Sarasota. Captain. Not Mr. Sullivan, Captain. A title. A profession. It's a new search parameter. I called Frank the next morning, my voice electric with excitement. "Forget the name for a minute," I said. "Search for a business." A boat charter business in the Sarasota area owned by a Michael Sullivan. That was active up until, say, 10 to 15 years ago. The new lead was the key that unlocked everything. 2 days later, Frank called me back. "I've got them," he said, and I could hear a note of professional satisfaction in his voice. Captain Michael Sullivan ran a successful deep-sea fishing charter called the Lucky Sullivan out of the Sarasota Marina for 30 years, he explained. Then, 12 years ago, he sold the business, the boat, everything. That's why he vanished from the public records. He retired. "Where are they now?" I asked, my breath held. He and his wife bought a small, quiet house about 30 miles inland in a town called Arcadia. They've been there ever since. Paid cash for the house with the money from the sale of the business. Living a quiet middle-class retirement. According to their credit report, their only vice is a shared passion for gardening. They were real. They were alive. They were stable. My brother's narrative, the one about the Florida trash, deadbeats, was a complete and utter fabrication. The next step was the most delicate. We had to make contact. We agreed I couldn't be the one to do it. The name Vance would be a red flag. Frank would make the initial call, posing as a Beoka'a, spacing as a neutral third-party agent working on a family matter. He called me back an hour after he had spoken to them. His voice was different. The professional satisfaction was gone, replaced by a tone of grim, human sympathy. "Well," he said with a heavy sigh, "I know why you couldn't find them. And I know why they never came looking for the kids." He told me the story as told to him by a weeping Helen Sullivan. The Sullivans had been thrilled when Lori had her first child, Jenna. They had doted on her. But they had always deeply distrusted Danny. They saw him for what he was, a charismatic, predatory con man. They had begged Lori to leave him, especially after the twins were born and his financial schemes became more and more reckless. About 12 years ago, after a particularly nasty fight in which Michael had threatened to report Danny to the authorities. For a fraudulent business he was running, Danny had laid down the law. He had told the Sullivans that Lori had chosen him, that she wanted nothing more to do with her parents, who he claimed were a toxic influence. He told them that if they ever tried to contact him, Lori, or their grandchildren ever again, he would pack up the family and disappear. And they would never, ever see them again. And the Sullivans, heartbroken but believing they were respecting their daughter's wishes, had complied. For 12 years they had lived in a quiet, painful exile, sending birthday cards and Christmas presents to old dead addresses, receiving nothing in return. They had no idea Lori had abandoned the children. They had no idea Danny was in prison. They thought their grandchildren were safe, simply being kept from them. "They're heartbroken, Dr. Vance," Frank said, "completely and utterly devastated." But the first question Helen asked me, through her tears, was, "Are they okay? Are my babies okay? And when can we see them?" Closed my eyes. The sheer, calculated cruelty of my brother's actions. A cold, heavy weight in my chest. He hadn't just neglected his children. He actively, systematically, and maliciously isolated them from a loving, stable family, all to maintain his own pathetic sense of control. He had kept them as his prisoners, his emotional collateral. For over a decade, my last shred of familial duty towards him, the last faint echo of the little sister who had once adored him, died in that moment. My path was now crystal clear. This was no longer just about saving the children. It was about undoing his greatest, most evil lie. "Frank," I said, my voice now steady, my mission clear, "ask them if they would be willing to meet with me. I have a proposal for them." I hung up the phone and walked to my study. Robert was there waiting, watching my face. "You found them," he said. "I did," I replied. "And it's worse and better than we could have imagined." I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I was no longer a historian, an investigator, or a grieving sister. I was an emissary, an architect of a new future for 5 children who had been denied one. I clicked on a travel website. I booked a single one-way ticket to Sarasota, Florida. My revenge, my true, final, and most satisfying revenge on my brother was at hand. I was not going to abandon his children. I was going to give them back the family that he had stolen from them. The flight from Asheville to Sarasota was a journey toward a fragile, unproven hypothesis. I was a historian flying to meet a primary source. A woman on her way to present a theory based on a single, heartbreaking letter and a grainy wedding announcement from a digital archive. I held in my briefcase a meticulously prepared file, complete with the private investigator's report, copies of the children's birth certificates, and a legally drafted proposal for a multi-million-dollar trust. It was the most important research project of my life, and the fate of 5 innocent children rested on its outcome. Robert had wanted to come with me, but we had agreed it was better for me to go alone. This was a delicate diplomatic mission. I was an emissary from a world of pain they didn't yet know existed, and my presence alone would be a shock. Adding another stranger to the mix would be too much. The address the investigator had given me was in Arcadia, a small, quiet town inland from the coastal bustle of Sarasota. It was a place of old oak trees draped in Spanish moss and modest, well-kept homes. I found the Sullivans' house on a quiet, tree-lined street. It was a simple, pale yellow ranch house with a perfectly manicured lawn and a garden bursting with vibrant, colorful hibiscus and bougainvillea. It was the picture of a peaceful, stable, middle-class retirement. It was the complete antithesis of my brother's entire chaotic existence. I sat in my rental car for a full 10 minutes, my heart pounding, a profound sense of doubt washing over me. Who was I to show up on these people's doorstep and detonate a bomb in the middle of their quiet lives? I was about to tell them that their estranged daughter was a fugitive. Their son-in-law was a convicted felon, and their 5 grandchildren, whom they believed were being kept from them, were in fact abandoned and on the verge of being swallowed by the foster care system. I took a deep breath, clutching the file in my lap. I thought of Jenna's letter, of her small, brave pencil drawings. I'm a historian, I told myself. And the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than a lie. I walked up the neat concrete path and rang the doorbell. The woman who answered was in her late 60s, with kind, tired eyes and the same dark curly hair I remembered from Lori's high school photos. It was Helen Sullivan. She looked at me, a polite but questioning smile on her face. "Yes? Can I help you, Mrs. Sullivan?" I said, my voice unsteady. My name is Eleanor Vance. I believe I am your son-in-law's sister." The polite smile on her face did not falter, but a sudden guarded wall came up in her eyes. It was a look I recognized, the carefully constructed neutrality of a person bracing for pain. "I see," she said, her voice cool. "I'm afraid we haven't had any contact with that family in many years." "I know," I said gently, "and the reasons you were given for that are why I am here. May I please come in? I have something to show you. It's about your grandchildren." The word grandchildren was the key. The wall in her eyes wavered, replaced by a flicker of a deep, ancient grief. She hesitated for a moment. Then slowly, she opened the door. For the next 2 hours, I sat in their clean, quiet living room, surrounded by photos of a daughter they no longer knew, and I told them the truth. I was not emotional. I was not accusatory. I was a historian, laying out a timeline of events, presenting my evidence. I told them about Danny's schemes, his conviction, his 15-year sentence. I told them about Lori's disappearance, a fact that seemed to physically break Helen's heart. And then I took out the drawings from Jenna's letter. I laid the 5 small pencil-drawn portraits out on the coffee table. The self-portrait of the sad-eyed teenage girl, the grinning twin boys, the serious little girl, the happy, smiling 5-year-old. "These are your grandchildren," I said softly. Jenna, Mark, and Matt. Sophie and Leo. Michael Sullivan, a big, quiet man with the weathered face and powerful hands of a fisherman, reached out a trembling finger and touched the edge of Jenna's portrait. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Single silent tear rolled down his cheek and splashed onto the table. Helen was sobbing openly now, a quiet, shuddering grief for a decade of lost time, of stolen memories. He told us. She wept, her voice a ragged whisper. He told us Lori didn't want us in their lives. He said we were a bad influence. That if we tried to call, he would move them away and we would never find them. We sent presents every year. They were always returned. We thought we were respecting our daughter's wishes. We didn't know. Oh God, we didn't know. After the grief had subsided into a state of stunned, heartbroken shock, I pivoted from the past to the future. I pushed the rest of the file across the table. This is not just a problem I am bringing you, I said, my voice now shifting to one of calm, practical authority. This is a solution I am proposing. I walked them through it. The trust, the legal documents, all drafted and ready to be signed. I explained that the money I had set aside was not charity. It was a tool. It was the capital required to fix the catastrophic failure my brother had created. The fund was substantial enough to purchase a larger home in their neighborhood, to cover all 5 children's living expenses, their health care, their clothing, and to provide full 4-year college tuition for each of them should they choose. To go. I cannot be their mother, I said, looking at them both. My husband and I. We are not equipped to give them the home they need. But you are. You are their grandparents. And I am willing to provide the means, if you are willing to provide the love. They stared at the proposal, at the numbers, at the sheer, overwhelming scope of the plan I had laid before them. Michael was the first to speak. Yeah. He looked up from the trust document, his eyes clear and full of a fierce, grandfatherly resolve. When can we get them? He said. The reunion was a logistical miracle, orchestrated over the next 3 weeks by a team of social workers, lawyers, and one very determined retired history professor. The Sullivans, with a down payment wired from the newly established trust, secured a 5-bedroom house just a few streets over from their own. And then, finally, the day came. We all met at a neutral, quiet CPS facility in Atlanta. Robert flew in to be with me. The Sullivans were already there, pacing nervously, their faces a mixture of terror and ecstatic hope. And then a door opened, and Ms. Garcia walked in, followed by 5 children, who looked small, scared, and huddled together for protection. Jenna, the 16-year-old, stood at the front, her arm protectively around 10-year-old Sophie. The twin 14-year-old boys stood behind her like sentinels. And clinging to Jenna's other hand was 5-year-old Leo, his eyes wide and fearful. Helen Sullivan let out a soft cry. She took a tentative step forward, her hands outstretched, but not daring to touch them. "Jenna," she whispered, Do you remember me? I'm your grandma, Helen, and this is your grandpa, Michael." Jenna just stared, her face a mask of stoic, guarded confusion. It was Leo, the youngest, who broke the spell. He looked from his sister's face to the weeping woman with the kind eyes, and he asked a simple, childish question. "Are you the grandma my mommy told me about? The one with the boat?" Sullivan let out a choked sob. He knelt, his old knees cracking so he was on eye level with the little boy. "Son," he said, his voice thick with a decade of unshed tears, "I'm the one with the boat, and I have been waiting a very, very long time to take you fishing." And with that, The dam of years of pain and lies and separation broke. Helen moved forward and enveloped the younger children in a hug, her body shaking with sobs of pure, unadulterated love. Jenna, the stoic, strong 16-year-old who had been trying to hold her family together, watched for a moment, and then her own carefully constructed walls crumbled. She buried her face in her grandfather's shoulder, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to just be a child. Robert and I stood in the background, watching the fragile, beautiful, and messy beginning of a new family. My work was done. I had not been their savior. I had simply been a historian who had uncovered the truth, okay? And an architect who had provided the resources to build a new foundation. Later, before we left, Jenna came to me. The guarded, fearful look was gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet, profound understanding. "He always told us they didn't want us," she said. "Our whole lives." "I know," I said. She looked at me, her eyes shining. "You didn't abandon us, Aunt Eleanor," she said. "You found us." She gave me a quick, fierce hug. A hug that contained a decade of gratitude. And then she ran back to her family. Her real family. The flight home to Asheville was quiet. I watched the clouds drift by below, a soft white blanket covering the messy, complicated world. My revenge on my brother was complete. It was not the revenge of his children's abandonment, but the revenge of their salvation. I had not destroyed him. I had simply rendered him and his lies completely and utterly irrelevant. When we got home, the house was just as we had left it, quiet, peaceful, and filled with books. I walked into my sunroom and sat down at my desk, the half-finished notes on my Silk Road project waiting for me. Picked up my pen. The world was a logical, beautiful, and endlessly fascinating place. And my own small, quiet corner of it had never felt more like home. The autumn in the Blue Ridge Mountains that year was particularly beautiful. Its crisp air and the riot of color in the trees outside. Our windows should have felt like a triumphant affirmation of the peace we had restored to our lives. And it was peaceful. The angry phone calls from my brother had ceased. The judgmental emails from extended family had trickled to a stop. The crisis was, technically, over. But the silence that remained was not the serene, scholarly quiet I had cherished before. It was a hollow, echoing silence, filled with the ghosts of 5 children whose faces I barely knew. I had done the logical thing, the right thing. But the emotional fallout was a long, slow ache in my soul. I found myself wandering through our quiet house, looking at the empty spaces and imagining the chaos of a large family. I would be reading in my study and wonder, is Jenna drawing right now? I would see Robert in the garden and think the twins would probably love learning about that from him. They were a constant, invisible presence in our quiet lives. A problem I had solved on paper but could not dismiss from my heart. We received weekly updates from Ms. Garcia at CPS and later from the Sullivan's lawyer in Florida. The transition was proceeding smoothly from a legal and logistical standpoint. The trust was fully funded. The Sullivans had purchased a larger 5-bedroom house in their quiet Arcadia neighborhood. The custody transfer was approved by the courts. The children were, according to the official reports, safe. But were they happy? The question haunted me. The invitation arrived in late October. It was a simple handwritten card from Helen Sullivan. "Dear Eleanor and Robert," it read, "it has been a whirlwind of a few months, filled with challenges and more joy than we ever thought we would feel again. The children are settling in. They are wonderful. Michael and I would be so honored if you would consider joining us for our first Thanksgiving as a new family. We know it is a long trip, and we understand completely if you cannot, but we want. You two know that you will always have a place at our table. I held the card, my hands trembling slightly. It was an invitation not just to a dinner, but into the new world I had created but never seen. It was a chance to replace the ghosts in my head with real, living children. "We should go," Robert said, reading the card over my shoulder, his voice quiet but firm. "You need to see this, Ellie. You need to see the result of your work." He was right. I needed to close the final chapter. I needed to see for myself that my difficult, painful decision had been the right one. The journey to Florida was a pilgrimage. We arrived the day before Thanksgiving to a scene of beautiful, chaotic, and vibrant life. The Sullivans' new house was not the pristine, quiet home I had first visited. It was a home that was being thoroughly lived in. A bicycle was overturned. In the driveway, a half-finished board game was spread across the living room floor. The air smelled of baking pies, and the house was filled with the sound of a television. The bickering of teenage boys, and the high-pitched happy shriek of a 5-year-old. It was the sound of a family. Helen and Michael Sullivan greeted us at the door with hugs that were no longer hesitant, but full of a deep, profound gratitude that left me speechless. They looked tired, happier, and 10 years younger than they had just a few months before. And then I saw the children. They were not the huddled, terrified little refugees I had seen in the CPS facility. They were just kids. The serious 10-year-old and up and gave me a shy hug before immediately dragging me to the kitchen to show me the pumpkin pie she had helped her grandmother make. The twin boys, Mark and Matt, were in the backyard throwing a football with their grandfather. Their lanky teenage bodies full of an energy that was no longer angry, but joyful. And little Leo, the 5-year-old, who had been a silent, clinging child, ran up to Robert and began chattering a mile a minute about the lizard he had just found in the garden. But my eyes were on Jenna, the 16-year-old artist, the stoic, parentified child who had been carrying the weight of her entire family on her small shoulders. She was sitting on the back porch, a sketch pad in her lap, her long hair falling over her face. She was not drawing her siblings. She was sketching the hibiscus flowers in her grandmother's garden, her face a mask of quiet, focused concentration. The deep, weary sadness in her eyes had been replaced by a peaceful creativity. She looked up, saw me watching, and gave me a small, genuine smile. It was a smile that said, "It's okay. We're okay." And in that single, simple gesture, I felt the last heavy stone of guilt lift from my heart. Thanksgiving Day was a symphony of glorious, chaotic normalcy. The house was filled with the delicious, comforting smells of roasting turkey and baking. Bread. Robert, to my immense surprise, was roped into a loud, competitive video game with the twins. And from the sounds of their laughter, he was losing badly. I spent the morning in the kitchen with Helen and Sophie, listening to them chatter as we peeled potatoes and set the long dining room table in a quiet moment. Helen and I were alone, standing by the stove. "He's a good man, your Robert," she said, stirring a pot of gravy. "He's wonderful with the boys. Michael has already promised to take all 3 of them fishing next weekend. He's happy," I said. "I haven't seen him this animated in years." Helen turned off the burner and looked at me, her expression full of an emotion so deep it was almost painful to witness. "You gave him that, Eleanor," she said, her voice thick. "You gave all of us that. I want you to know, it hasn't all been easy. There are still nightmares. Sophie still sometimes wakes up crying for a mother who isn't here. Jenna has a lot of anger at her father that she's working through in therapy. The boys are behind in school." She paused, taking a deep breath. "They are healing. For the first time in their lives, they feel safe. They feel loved. You didn't just give us the money to care for them, Eleanor. You gave us back our lives. You gave these children back their childhoods. There are no words in the world to thank you for a gift like that. Later, I found Michael on the back porch, watching the boys play. We stood in a comfortable silence for a long time. I got a letter from Danny last week, he said finally. His voice a low rumble. From prison was a long, rambling thing, full of self-pity, blaming everyone but himself. He was angry that I had used the money from his rich bitch sister to buy this house. I flinched at the second-hand insult, but Michael just shook his head. I wrote him back, he said. I told him that the money had nothing to do with him, that this was his sister's doing, a final act of profound responsibility for a mess she did not create. I told him that the children were happy and safe, and that they were now Sullivans. And I told him not to write again. It was the final, definitive closing of a door. The final, quiet erasure of my brother from the narrative he had tried so hard to control. He was a ghost from a past that no longer had any power over this new, thriving family. The dinner itself was a loud, happy, and messy affair. We all squeezed. Around the long table, a strange, cobbled together family forged in the fires of crisis and bound by a shared, complicated history. There were arguments over the last dinner roll. There were spilled glasses of water. There was laughter, so much laughter. As we were clearing the plates, Jenna came up to me, her sketchbook in her hand. She was shy, but her eyes were bright. "I wanted to give you this," she said, and handed me a drawing. It was a portrait of me. A simple, beautiful pencil sketch. She had drawn me in the sunroom of my own home, surrounded by my books, a gentle, peaceful smile on my face. It was the way she had seen me that first day, the day I had made the call that had changed all of our lives. Underneath, she had written a single word, architect. I stared at the drawing, at the incredible, undeserved gift, and my own eyes filled with tears. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was finally quiet, the four of us sat on the back porch, listening to the gentle sound of the Florida cicadas. "You know," I said, looking out at the dark, peaceful garden. For months, I was haunted by the thought that I had abandoned them, that I had chosen my own quiet life over their well-being. Helen reached over and squeezed my hand. "You did choose your own life, Eleanor," she said softly. "In doing so, you gave them a chance at one, too. You didn't give them a mother. You gave them a future. And that is a far greater gift." I looked at Robert, at these two good, decent people, and at the quiet, sleeping house full of children who were finally, truly safe. My revenge on my brother had never been about destroying him. It had been about creating this. It's a new story, a better one. I had not just researched history. I had, in my own small, quiet way, made it. And it was a legacy I could finally and completely be at peace with.